share, comment, and click on the subscribe button on the screen to subscribe to our channel for more real and true stories like this. I hadn't thought twice about Mark staying with us. He was family after all, and it made sense when my husband suggested he crash here for the weekend instead of paying for a hotel. Mark had recently taken a job in the city, and until he settled in, he'd been bouncing between friends' places and short-term rentals. I didn't mind at all. Mark was fun, easygoing, and he blended seamlessly into our lives, but the timing turned out to be a little strange. My husband got called out of town for a work emergency right after Mark arrived, leaving just the two of us in the house. "You'll be fine," my husband had said as he packed his bag. "Mark will keep you company." The first night passed in a blur of takeout and casual conversation. Mark had always been charming in a relaxed, effortless way, and I found myself laughing more than I had in a while. We stayed up later than I'd planned, sharing stories and sipping wine in the living room, the house filled with a warm, comfortable silence whenever we paused. I told myself it was just nice to have some company, but there was something else, a kind of undercurrent in the air that felt different. I pushed the feeling aside, thinking I was just tired, but the next day it was still there, lingering in the glances we exchanged, and in the subtle way Mark's hand would brush mine when he passed me something. It was almost imperceptible, easy to ignore if I chose to, but it made my heart beat a little faster every time. I had no reason to feel this way, no reason at all. Mark was my husband's cousin, someone I'd known for years, but something about being alone together, just the two of us, brought a kind of awareness that I didn't want to admit. I told myself it was nothing, just a reaction to the quiet house, the sudden change in plans. But when Mark looked at me, there was something in his eyes that made me question everything. The next morning I woke up with a strange sense of anticipation, a subtle awareness that I wasn't alone in the house. I could hear Mark in the kitchen, the clinking of cups and the smell of coffee wafting through the hallway. I quickly got dressed and joined him, trying to brush off the nervous energy I felt. When I walked in, he looked up and gave me an easy smile, handing me a mug of coffee. "Thought you could use this," he said, his voice warm and familiar. I took the mug, feeling the warmth of his fingers lingering against mine for a moment longer than necessary. "Thanks," I replied, trying to keep my voice steady. We moved to the dining table, and he began telling me about his job, his new life in the city, and the frustrations of navigating it all. It felt natural, the way we fell into conversation, but beneath it all, I could feel that strange energy still there, like a current humming just beneath the surface. At one point, he leaned forward, resting his hand close to mine on the table, and I felt a shiver run down my spine. His presence seemed larger than life in the quiet of the house, each glance and every small gesture carrying an unintended weight. We'd been talking for nearly an hour, but it felt like minutes. When I got up to clear our mugs, he followed me to the sink. We stood side by side, our arms brushing as we worked, and I was painfully aware of how close we were. I could feel his eyes on me as I turned to set the dishes aside, and when I finally looked up, our faces were closer than I'd realized. I could see the faint stubble along his jaw, the hint of a smile that played at the corner of his lips. I took a step back, breaking the spell, and forced a laugh, trying to shake off the tension. "We should probably find something to do, or we'll end up drinking coffee all day," I said, hoping it would lighten the moment. He agreed, and we decided to take a walk around the neighborhood, a neutral, harmless way to fill the day. Outside, the air was cool, and we fell into a comfortable rhythm as we walked. The tension between us eased a little, but it wasn't gone entirely. We talked about anything and everything, from our favorite music to the small frustrations of life, sharing things we'd never really discussed before. I felt myself relaxing, letting my guard down, and there were moments when we'd laugh or share a look that felt just a bit too meaningful. At one point, as we paused near a small park, Mark turned to me, his expression more serious than before. "You know, it's been really nice being here. I didn't expect it to feel so easy." His voice was soft, and I could feel my cheeks flush under his gaze. "I feel the same," I replied quietly, feeling a mixture of guilt and excitement that I couldn't quite shake. Standing there, with the world moving around us, it felt as if we were in our own bubble, a place where consequences didn't exist. After the walk, we spent the rest of the afternoon around the house, cooking together and laughing about silly things. There was an ease between us that felt new, a kind of intimacy that didn't belong. By the time evening rolled around, I was acutely aware of how the day had changed something between us. Every shared look, every casual touch felt deliberate, like we were moving toward a line neither of us wanted to cross but couldn't seem to avoid. As we sat down for dinner, I felt the weight of everything that had gone unsaid hanging in the air. The candlelight cast a warm glow across the table, and I caught myself watching him more than I should have, noticing the way his eyes would linger on me just a second too long. I was torn between wanting to say something to break the tension and wanting to let it grow, curious to see where it might lead. When the meal was over, I cleared the dishes and found myself standing by the sink, lost in thought. Suddenly, Mark was beside me again, reaching past me to grab a glass from the shelf. The closeness was dizzying, and I felt my heart pound as he leaned in, his arm brushing against mine. "Thanks for everything today," he murmured, his voice low and close to my ear. I could feel the warmth of his breath, and for a brief moment, I didn't move, didn't breathe, caught in the magnetic pull of his presence. I turned slightly, our faces just inches apart, and for a heartbeat, it felt like everything else faded away. But before I could say anything, he straightened, giving me a small, almost knowing smile before stepping back, leaving me standing there, my mind racing with thoughts I didn't want to admit. That night, I lay awake for hours, my mind replaying every small moment between us. Every glance, every laugh, every brush of his hand lingered in my memory, making it impossible to relax. I kept trying to reason with myself, to push the feelings away, but they only grew more vivid in the quiet darkness. The next morning, I almost expected him to act differently, for something to be strained between us, but he was as calm and friendly as ever, falling into our usual banter over breakfast, and it was almost enough to convince me that maybe, just maybe, I'd imagined the whole thing. We kept busy, filling the day with errands and light conversation, as if to avoid giving ourselves any time alone with our thoughts. But by the time evening rolled around, the easy distractions faded, and the tension returned, creeping into the silences between us. When the sun dipped below the horizon, and the house filled with the soft glow of the lamps, I could feel the shift again. We were sitting in the living room, each of us on opposite ends of the couch, but it felt like an invisible thread was pulling us closer. Mark leaned forward, elbows on his knees, watching me with an intensity that made my heart race. I felt myself mirroring him, leaning closer without meaning to, until we were sitting only inches apart. His gaze flicked down to my hand resting on the couch, and for a moment I thought he might reach for it. I could feel the warmth radiating from him, and it felt like the room had shrunk, closing us into this small, charged space. "I don't think I've ever felt this way," he murmured, almost to himself. His voice was soft, filled with something vulnerable and raw, and the way he looked at me made it clear he wasn't talking about anything casual. I felt my throat tighten, and I struggled to find words. "Mark, we shouldn't," I whispered, even as my heart seemed to beat in time with his, caught in that same undeniable rhythm. "I know," he said, and for a moment the spell seemed to break. He leaned back, rubbing a hand over his face as if he were trying to shake himself free. "It's just this weekend, being here. It's felt different, more real than anything else." I knew exactly what he meant, because I'd felt it too. That strange, unexpected closeness that had grown between us, something I hadn't asked for but couldn't ignore. I could see the conflict in his eyes, the same one tearing at me. And for a split second, I thought about closing the distance, letting the pull between us finally win. But I knew if I did, there'd be no going back. Instead, I took a deep, shaky breath, forcing myself to stand. "I think we both need some space," I said, barely able to meet his eyes. Before something happens that we can't take back." He didn't argue. He just nodded, looking at me with an expression that held both regret and understanding. There was a heaviness in the air as I walked out of the room, and I felt his eyes on me the entire way. Once I was out of sight, I let out a breath I hadn't realized I was holding, my hands shaking as I tried to process everything. That night, I stayed in my room, keeping the door closed and lying awake, feeling the weight of everything we'd almost let ourselves fall into. It was like standing on the edge of a cliff, feeling the urge to jump, but knowing the fall would change everything. In the morning, Mark was already gone, leaving behind a note on the counter, thanking me for the weekend and wishing me the best. The message was simple, polite, like nothing unusual had happened, but I could sense the finality in it. It was as if he'd realized, just as I had, that this was something we couldn't let go further, something we both needed to walk away from while we still could. I stood there for a long time, reading and rereading his words, feeling a mix of relief and loss that I didn't quite know what to do with. The weekend was over, and life would go back to normal. But deep down, I knew that some part of me would always remember the way it had felt to almost cross that line, the tension that had woven itself into those quiet moments between us. It was something I'd carry with me, a secret memory that would fade over time, but never disappear entirely. And maybe that was for the best, leaving it as an almost, something that had come close but never quite touched, a feeling just on the edge of reality. Click on the subscribe button on the screen to subscribe to our channel for more real and true stories like this.